Energy drives the planet. It also drives these three inventors. You'll meet a man who makes objects float in the air, a guy who levitates UFOs in his basement, and a self-made scientist who's battled the U.S. government to bring his machine and cheap energy to the whole world. These are the new energy inventors, finding strange new ways to power the planet. What goes up must come down, right? Well, unless you've figured out a way to harness an untapped force in the universe. Enter this lab and everything you know gets tossed out the window. Welcome to the world of John Hutchison, where the improbable may just become our reality. John Hutchison has been dabbling with electricity for decades, copying the work of famed scientist Nikola Tesla, whose AC power still runs our world. Along the way, messing about with military surplus gear, John may have stumbled across one of the most amazing scientific discoveries of our age. Experimenting with radio waves and electricity led John to discover an effect which has mystified government and military scientists. It boils, it bends, it sends objects flying through the air.
I was building these replications of Tesla's old machines and found them doing fascinating things. Then this whole thing happened, this fluke kind of thing, the Hutchison effect.
This was some effect. Air squeezed out of bottles, ice drinks moving through space, drill bits levitating. An effect so convincing and so varied, it seemed impossible to fake.
In John's labs, I've actually seen levitation of rock. I've seen levitation of steel ball bearings, glass, where they will levitate. Unbelievable. I've seen electricity go right into the objects and a million pieces just fly apart.
In fact, using only 75 watts of energy, enough for a small light bulb, Hutchison made a 60-pound cannonball rise off the table. It would also fuse dissimilar materials, heat metal but not burn the wood it sat on, shatter metal as well as change its crystalline structure. This was something to write home about.
Beginning of 1980, experimenting with all the electromagnetics and electrostatic equipments I had at the time, I started to notice some very, very unusual effects, such as a room being filled up very quickly with multicolored lights, steel bars sitting on wood and not causing any fires, metal turning to jelly, things levitating and jumping off to the ceiling, or simply go up, hover, and then fall back down.
Dubbed by some as the poltergeist machine, there is no one machine, just a lot of old Army surplus gear, randomly tuned by John. No one knows how it works. John has apparently figured out the right combination of radio waves and electrical energy to create the effect. If it could be proven, its impact would be huge. You'd have to rewrite most of the science textbooks, especially the part about what goes up. And the story gets even weirder, involving both the Canadian and U.S. military intelligence.
Here we go, into my place. Canadian government seized my laboratory, which was 22 tons of equipment. I came back from Germany and moved into this place here and started my experiments again with Army surplus and Navy surplus equipments, which I got actually from warships, and bought a lot from various surplus stores in the United States and Canada, starting in 1994. And some of this equipment actually goes back to the 1940s, directional finding equipment, all kinds of neat configurations, waveforms and that, right up to 44 gigahertz. That gives me a wide range and wide spectrum of fields and that to work with.
Of course, given the potential magnitude of an effect which can turn metal into jelly and levitate objects, it wasn't long before news leaked out. In this case, to Colonel John Alexander with INSCOM, U.S. Army Intelligence, whose specialties included training people to bend metal with their minds, or PK, psychokinetic training.
Well, they had an 8mm film, and it was purported to have been taken in Canada, and it showed various items that were levitating, falling, accelerating, the breadth of materials that seemed to be affected by whatever the effect was certainly interesting, because it wasn't just metal. It clearly wasn't just some big magnet or something like that. And it was sufficiently interesting that we said, want to learn more about that. So we agreed to fund him.
Why was the Army so interested in John's effect? Well, look at all those objects going up instead of down. They knew a hot property when they saw it. This anti-gravity could have a huge impact on military aircraft. New types of propulsion in weight-reduced planes could fly higher and faster. So Colonel Alexander and his team went to Vancouver to test John's effect.
During 1983, U.S. Army Intelligence and Los Alamos National Laboratories set me up in a large laboratory. We did 4 months of testing.
We had a team of 6 people from Army Intelligence and from Los Alamos, including myself, that came out for the demonstration.
As usual, John revved up his machines to create his electronic force field to start the effect. Exactly what happened next is still debated by the various participants.
And things started off very good, actually, because there was a whole battery of lights, fluorescent lights that lit up really bright and then exploded, and then incandescent lamps in this massive warehouse lit up.
The effects that happened always happened when we were not present, and so cannot give any first-hand evidence.
Time progressed in all these experiments. We get mirrors breaking apart, odd voltage things happening.
But Colonel Alexander had given John some metal rods he used in his psychokinetic work to test the validity of people's metal bending claims. These rods could only be bent through extreme measures, like heating them to thousands of degrees.
Probably the most interesting was a molybdenum rod that I used in PK testing. And what had happened is he presented to me, it had a slight S-curve in the rod itself. We looked at it very carefully to see if it had been heated and gripped or something like that, and found no indication that it had. That suggested to us that there were effects that were going on.
In the end, Bob, a skeptical Los Alamos investigator, deemed the tests inconclusive. And according to this letter from Los Alamos, all documents pertaining to the Hutchison tests were destroyed.
According to Bob, the one man, things didn't work, and let's forget about it and classify it.
While officially the tests were brushed aside, Colonel Alexander has kept an open mind.
Even though nothing happened during our investigation when we were present, 5 of the 6 people present believed that it probably did happen. It just didn't happen, while we were there.
But the fact remained that the U.S. intelligence services left, apparently having written the effect off. Then on the 24th of February 1990, something strange happened. John was out of the country when his lab was forcibly seized by the Canadian government. Despite a court order to return it, John never got his equipment back. When he tried to move his experiments to Germany, The authorities there refused him permission. Months later, John heard a rumor that his brainchild was not dead and buried, but was being studied by the American military.
It was basically classified, and I've been hearing stories for years and feel now that they did get results and are replicating it at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works.
Was it a rumor, or was the largest military power on the planet experimenting with the Hutchison effect? John believes the Pentagon tests of his anti-gravity effect may have ended up at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, home to secret U.S. military projects, including new types of super aircraft and top-secret or black ops propulsion systems. Stranger still, Nick Cook, a writer for the respected British military journal Jane's Defense Weekly, found out about John Hutchison's work through one of Lockheed Martin's top scientists.
I was at Lockheed Martin. I was with Boyd Bushman, a senior engineer there, and he showed me a film that purported to show some of John Hutchison's levitation experiments. What we saw was a saw, some nails, a hammer, household stuff. Most of them were shooting off the top of the screen. It was almost like an impulse reaction. Normally I would have kind of looked at this stuff and just thought it's somebody's idea of a practical joke. But the fact that it was being highlighted to me by somebody from Lockheed Martin as something I should be paying attention to kind of got my attention. And that was what really convinced me to go and at least have a look at what John Hutchison was doing. I'm 99% convinced that this is not a hoax. I don't think anyone knows what is going on here, but too many people have looked into it, too many people have investigated. People who have my respect for me to think that it's a hoax.
Eventually, Lockheed Martin would send their own team to conduct tests. But John hasn't heard much since, and he worries about his technology being used for military purposes. Like Galileo in his time, who was imprisoned for looking too closely at stars, John and his technology have been stopped cold, shunned by mainstream science. Frustrated by his inability to bring this anti-gravity technology to the world, John spends his days gathering more Navy surplus gear for his much smaller apartment-based lab.
Oh, cool.
Got to try it to make sure it works.
Looks kind of great. That looks cool.
For those prone to claustrophobia, John's home is not the place to stay for drinks and a game of cards.
Living here in this space is like living inside a very cramped submarine. My girlfriends find this rather interesting and quite different. And actually I had some girlfriends stay overnight. They didn't seem to mind it. It hasn't got the best of things for feminine amenities, but they managed to tough it out, let's say. This is the shower box, I call it. Renamed the shower box, so when I come in here and after I get out of bed, I pull up my trusty navy-colored box, which contains all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff for growing hair and creams and stuff, and shaving equipment. Then I proceed to crawl into the little box there and start cupping myself with a cup of water and shave and all that. So I go into that routine and then think of what I'll be doing for the day. So what I have is this thing is on a string. It's a toy UFO. I'm going to suspend it from a string off the floor, firing energy fields at it and see if I can get it to even move.
Working on his effects research, John sees himself as more of an artist than scientist. Turning and twisting knobs like a painter. Dipping into electrical fields to access a random force field. But in this small lab, it's even less predictable than before. The saucer is moving and changing direction, but there might be other forces at work here. Colonel Alexander, who trained people in the U.S. Army Intelligence Service to bend metal using their minds, believes that John could be inadvertently creating the Hutchison effect through his own PK, or psychokinetic powers.
One of the possibilities is that the electronic fields were actually amplifying some sort of PK experience that he was having or causing to happen. It is not uncommon, if you study the whole field of poltergeist phenomena, that strange macro PK events occur and yet seem to be beyond the control of the individual who is causing it to happen.
An example of this kind of random event happened in 1989 when a visiting Vancouver news crew was setting up at John's lab to film the Hutchison effect. The target area was that yellow crate with the metal objects. But to everyone's shock, a sponge in the back of the room took off into the air and then fell back down. John didn't actually see it and was genuinely surprised.
Like that, it went up and hit the ceiling 1 second, maybe 2 seconds, and then came down.
You're kidding.
No.
Well, some time ago I was doing some testing and got into some big trouble after I levitated a toy UFO and some other objects.
Apparently, John's experiments were lifting objects in nearby homes, and the neighbors called the police.
The police came full bore in here with engineers, inspectors. They photographed all the equipments very carefully. It's almost like if you called in a cleaning crew. They didn't touch anything. It's like they made everything look neater for some strange reason.
It seems like someone in the shadows still cares what our hero is up to. Frustrated by authorities and lack of recognition, John has been spending time developing his new project, batteries that last forever, based on the somewhat bizarre zero-point energy theory. Followers of this theory believe that all physical matter floats in a sea of energy, which, if collected and converted into electrical power, could more than meet all the world's demand for energy.
I feel everything has a life force to it, because I tend to visualize that atoms are a whole universe, and when they're combining one atom to make millions, if not trillions of them, you have a piece of metal, perhaps. Every time you run your hand across a piece of metal, you're taking off several million atoms at a time.
To demonstrate how energy is everywhere, John uses rocks from his neighborhood and in 2 hours makes a zero-point battery strong enough to power a pen light.
I make sure it bonds. Almost 1/2 electron volt. This is better than a conventional battery, simply because it never runs down. So with these things, they could last approximately as long as minerals last, up to maybe 1,000 years, unknown.
Realizing his batteries could help solve the world's energy crisis, the Japanese have embraced John and funded him to build his bigger crystal-based models.
I got orders from Japan in sponsorship for me to make more of them. So the money would come through into my bank account, and indeed I made units that are actually in Hiroshima City.
While various zero-point energy devices were funded by the Japanese, so far none have taken off on a mass scale.
John Hutchison is probably the very visual proponent of the whole kind of zero-point energy movement. Zero-point energy devices could revolutionize the planet. If you can build a zero-point energy reactor about the size of your microwave oven, put it in the back of your house somewhere, you run your house. You run all its electricity needs. You don't need to pull anything off the national grid. Well, if you put that into the third world, you're going to revolutionize the third world. That is as much a threat to some people as it is a benefit.
And as far as the Hutchison effect goes, I'm rather disturbed that the U.S. government and aerospace corporations has it. The concerns of it being used for an evil force by the military-industrial complex disturbs me quite a bit. I like to see it used for the helping of nature, because there's so much pollution going on with nature. Mankind tends to want to fight each other all the time with wars, whereas Mother Nature rolls on with great energy and power. If we don't take charge of our environment and nature and try and clean up the mess we laid behind us, basically what happens is that she'll close us down, causing global warming to happen a lot faster, causing all kinds of disturbing things that make us sick and ill.
It's absolutely essential for the world and survival of the world that we get off petrochemicals. Failure to do so, it really threatens our national survival.
What I like about John is that he doesn't compromise. He doesn't compromise his appearance. He doesn't compromise his lifestyle. What he does is pretty unconventional. So, good on him. I'm all for that, and I wouldn't want him to change. He's fine just the way he is.
Whether building batteries or levitating objects, John Hutchison is an eccentric enigma. Of course, virtually no mainstream scientists take John or his invention seriously. But then only a little over 100 years ago, people believed it was impossible to send a radio wave across the Atlantic. Now just imagine if this backyard scientist really has discovered a primal force of nature that could transform our world.
I am only taken seriously by the military scientists. The academic scientists really don't know what to make of me. Well, to say a lot of other people too don't know what to make of me. I'm just a different person, and I'm kind of happy with myself. I don't want to try and change myself.
Well, unless you've figured out a way to harness an untapped force in the universe. Enter this lab and everything you know gets tossed out the window. Welcome to the world of John Hutchison, where the improbable may just become our reality. John Hutchison has been dabbling with electricity for decades, copying the work of famed scientist Nikola Tesla, whose AC power still runs... What goes up must come down, right? Energy drives the planet. It also drives these three inventors. You'll meet a man who makes objects float in the air, a guy who levitates UFOs in his basement, and a self-made scientist who's battled the U.S. government to bring his machine and cheap energy to the whole world. These are the new energy inventors, finding strange new ways to power the planet.